Elena Whitmore felt the eyes of the entire pack burn into her skin before Alpha Damien Ashford even opened his mouth. The packhouse hall was packed shoulder to shoulder, torches throwing long shadows across stone walls, and every single wolf present already sensed that something terrible was about to happen. Elena stood in the center of the room, in her ceremonial white dress, the one meant for the mate acceptance ritual, and her hands trembled at her sides. Damien would not look at her. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked through the silence like a whip. "I reject you, Elena Whitmore, as my fated mate." The words hit her like a physical blow. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elena's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her collapse. The rejection bond tore through her chest, a pain unlike anything she had ever felt, as if something essential had been ripped from inside her body and thrown into the fire. Behind Damien, standing close enough to touch him, was Bianca Hart, Elena's cousin. The same cousin who had grown up beside her, who had shared her childhood bedroom for 3 summers when Bianca's parents traveled for pack business, who had once cried into Elena's shoulder over a broken engagement and promised she would never do anything to hurt her. Bianca's eyes were downcast, her hands folded in front of her like a woman in mourning, rather than a woman who had just stolen another woman's future. But Elena caught the flicker beneath those lowered lashes, a flicker of triumph, quickly hidden, but not hidden well enough. "I have chosen Bianca as my Luna," Damien continued, his voice steadier now that the worst was over. "The bond between us formed the moment I caught her scent 3 nights ago. I did not choose this, it happened, and I will not deny what nature has decided." Elena wanted to scream that nature had nothing to do with it, that she had felt Damien's mate pull for 6 months, ever since she turned 21, and the bond activated between them, strong and true and undeniable. She wanted to ask how a bond could simply vanish and attach itself to someone else within 3 days. But the pack elders were already nodding along, murmuring their approval, because who questioned the words of an alpha standing in his own hall? She looked at Bianca once more. Her cousin still would not meet her eyes directly, but there was something in the way she stood, chin tilted just slightly upward, shoulders relaxed in a room where everyone else radiated tension, that told Elena this scene had been rehearsed. Bianca was playing a role, and she was playing it well. "Elena," Damien said, and for one brief second, something flickered across his face. Something that looked almost like regret. "You will remain part of this pack. You will be given work and shelter. I owe you that much." "Owe me that much," Elena repeated silently in her head. As if 6 months of promises, of stolen kisses under the training yard oak tree, of whispered plans about the home they would build together, once the mating ceremony was complete, could be repaid with a servant's cot and daily chores. She did not cry. She refused to cry in front of these people. Instead, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked out of the hall without another word, her white ceremonial dress trailing behind her like a shroud for the life she had expected to live. The walk back to the family quarters felt endless. Every hallway she passed seemed to whisper with the news already spreading through the pack. She caught snippets of conversation as she moved. "Did you hear? Rejected in front of everyone. Poor Elena. Lucky Bianca. The alpha finally found his true mate." Each word cut deeper than the last, though none of them cut as deep as the hollow ache still radiating from her chest, where the broken bond had been. Her mother, Miriam, was waiting outside their quarters, having clearly heard already through the pack's rapid gossip network. Miriam had once served as the pack's head healer before an injury forced her into early retirement, and her sharp eyes missed nothing, not even now, not even through her own shock and worry. "Elena," her mother said softly, reaching for her daughter's hands, "I am so sorry." "I don't want to talk about it," Elena managed, though her voice wavered on every word. "I just want to be alone." Miriam did not push. She simply squeezed Elena's hands once, a silent promise that she would be there when Elena was ready to talk, and stepped aside to let her daughter pass into the small room that had once felt like home and now felt like nothing but a temporary shelter before an uncertain future. Elena sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after the door closed, staring at nothing. She thought about the way Damien's eyes had refused to meet hers, The way his voice had sounded almost mechanical when he spoke the rejection words, as if he were reciting a script rather than speaking from his heart. She thought about the strange flicker of triumph on Bianca's face, quickly masked behind an expression of shy modesty. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, in the part of her that had spent 23 years learning to read her cousin's every expression, every tell, every carefully constructed lie. Bianca had always been good at getting what she wanted. Elena remembered now, with startling clarity, the small things she had brushed aside over the years, because family loyalty demanded it. The way toys would go missing from Elena's room, only to reappear in Bianca's a week later. The way Bianca would cry to adults about imagined slights until she received an apology and a gift to make up for it. The way she had once convinced an entire summer camp that Elena had stolen from the counselor's private stash of sweets, when in truth, it had been Bianca all along, and Elena had taken the blame rather than expose her cousin as a liar. Elena had always excused it. She's young. She's insecure. She doesn't mean any real harm. But now, sitting alone in a room that no longer felt safe, Elena wondered how much of Bianca's sweet, gentle nature had ever been real at all. A knock came at her door an hour later. It was not her mother's knock, light and familiar. This one was firmer, more official. Elena opened it to find Greta, one of the senior pack matriarchs, standing with a clipboard and an expression of polite indifference. "You have been reassigned to household duties," Greta announced without preamble. "Kitchen work in the mornings, laundry in the afternoons. You will move to the Eastern Servant Wing by tomorrow evening. Your new quarters are smaller, but adequate." Elena stared at the older woman, disbelief washing over her in a fresh wave. Reassigned, as if she were furniture being moved from one room to another, rather than a woman whose entire future had just been destroyed in front of the whole pack. By whose order? Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Alpha Ashford's," Greta said simply, and there was something almost apologetic in her tone, though not enough to change anything. "He believes it would be best for you to have purpose. Work helps with healing, or so he says." Elena wanted to laugh, though nothing about the situation was funny. Work helps with healing, as if scrubbing pots and folding linens could mend a broken mate bond, could erase 6 months of promises, could make her forget the way Damien used to look at her, like she was the only person in the world worth seeing. She nodded once, sharply, because there was nothing else to do. Greta left, and Elena closed the door, leaning her back against it as the full weight of her new reality settled over her shoulders. That night, sleep refused to come. Elena lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the rejection ceremony over and over in her mind, searching for details she might have missed the first time. She thought about the timeline Damien had given, 3 nights ago. That was the night of the harvest gathering, when the entire pack had celebrated together in the Great Hall, when Elena herself had been present, dancing with Damien under strings of lantern light, feeling more certain of their future than she had ever felt about anything. If the bond had truly shifted that night, why had Damien danced with her until nearly midnight, his hand warm against her waist, his eyes soft with affection that felt nothing like a man on the verge of rejecting his mate? Something did not add up. Elena had spent her whole life being told to trust her instincts, that a wolf's senses rarely lied even when human logic tried to explain them away, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that the story she had been told in that hall was not the truth. The next morning, Elena rose before dawn, her body aching from a sleepless night, and began packing what little she owned into a single canvas bag. As she folded her clothes, her mother appeared in the doorway once more, watching with an unreadable expression. "You believe there is more to this," Miriam said. It was not a question. Elena paused, a folded blouse in her hands. "Doesn't it seem strange to you? 3 nights. That's all it took for 6 months of bonding to just disappear?" "Mate bonds have shifted before," her mother said carefully, though her tone suggested she did not fully believe her own words. "It is rare, but it has happened. A stronger pull can override a weaker one." "But I felt it too," Elena said, her voice rising with frustration. "I felt the bond just as strongly as he claims to have felt his shift. If it were truly gone, wouldn't I feel that absence in some way, some warning, some change? Instead, I felt nothing different until the moment he stood in that hall and tore it away in front of everyone." Miriam was quiet for a long moment, her healer's mind clearly working through the possibilities, weighing years of pack medicine knowledge against her daughter's raw grief. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she feared being overheard even within their own private quarters. "There are old stories," she said slowly, "about bonds being manipulated, forced. It requires dark practices, forbidden by pack law for generations, but the stories exist for a reason." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Forced how?" "I don't know the details," Miriam admitted. "It was never something taught openly, only whispered about as a warning to young healers, a reminder of what not to seek out, no matter how desperate a situation might seem. But if such a thing is possible, and if someone wanted your bond with Damien badly enough to attempt it..." She did not need to finish the sentence. Elena already understood exactly who her mother was thinking of, because it was the same name circling endlessly through her own mind since the moment the rejection had been spoken. Bianca. Elena finished packing in silence, her mind racing through implications too large to fully grasp yet. If her mother's suspicion held any truth, then this was not simply a broken heart, not simply bad luck or fate cruelly rearranging itself. This was theft. This was deception on a scale that could shatter the entire pack's trust if exposed, and it meant that somewhere within the pack house walls, her cousin was living a lie so enormous that Elena's mind struggled to comprehend the audacity of it. She thought of Bianca's downcast eyes in the hall, the flicker of triumph quickly hidden. She thought of the years of small thefts and clever manipulations she had excused as childish insecurity. She thought of Damien's mechanical voice, his refusal to meet her gaze, the way his affection during the harvest dance had felt so achingly real just 3 nights before everything fell apart. By the time the sun fully rose over the pack house, casting golden light through her window, Elena had made a decision. She would not simply accept this reassignment, this quiet erasure from the life she had built. She would find out the truth, no matter how long it took or how many pack laws she had to bend in the process. As she carried her canvas bag toward the eastern servant wing that morning, walking past pack members who whispered and stared, Elena caught sight of Bianca across the courtyard. Her cousin was laughing softly at something one of the pack warriors had said, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, in a gesture that looked almost protective, almost possessive, as if she were already imagining herself as Luna, already tasting the power that title would bring. Bianca glanced up and their eyes met across the distance. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely. Elena saw something cold and calculating pass behind her cousin's gaze, something that had nothing to do with innocence or shyness, or the gentle nature Bianca had spent years cultivating in front of the pack. Then Bianca smiled, sweet and soft, and called out a greeting as if nothing at all had changed between them, as if she had not just stolen Elena's entire future, with a smile still curling at the corners of her lips. Elena smiled back, forcing every muscle in her face to cooperate, and continued walking toward her new life in the servant quarters. But inside, a new resolve was hardening, cold and sharp as steel. She would uncover the truth behind this rejection. She would find out exactly what her cousin had done, and how she had done it. And when the truth finally came to light, Elena would make certain that everyone who had witnessed her humiliation in that hall would witness Bianca's downfall as well. The eastern servant wing was smaller and dimmer than the family quarters Elena had grown up in. The walls thinner, the furniture sparse and worn from years of use by pack members with no status to speak of. Elena set her canvas bag down on the narrow bed and looked around the tiny room that was now hers, feeling the strangeness of it settle over her like an ill-fitting coat. Yesterday she had been the Alpha's intended mate, destined to become Luna of one of the strongest packs in the region. Today she was a servant, assigned to scrub floors and fold linens, her status stripped away as easily as her white ceremonial dress had been packed into storage. But status could be rebuilt, reputation could be restored. What could not be forgiven? Elena decided, as she unpacked her few belongings with steady, determined hands, was deception on the scale she now suspected had taken place. If Bianca had truly manipulated the mate bond through forbidden means, then she had not only stolen Elena's future, she had trapped Damien in a lie he did not even know he was living. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the anger and grief and humiliation, Elena felt a flicker of something else. Not quite hope, Not yet, but the first stirring of purpose. She would find proof. She would expose the truth, and she would reclaim what had been stolen from her, no matter what it took, or how long the journey ahead might prove to be. Outside her small window, the pack house bells rang out across the grounds, calling wolves to their morning duties, and Elena Whitmore took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward into the first day of a fight she had never asked for, but now intended to win. The kitchen was already alive with noise and steam when Elena reported for her first morning of servant duties. Pots clanged against stone counters, the smell of baking bread filled the air, and a dozen pack members moved through the space with practiced efficiency, none of them sparing more than a passing glance at the woman who had, until yesterday, been destined to rule over all of them. Elena tied an apron around her waist and got to work without complaint, scrubbing pots until her hands turned red and raw, carrying trays of food to the long tables where pack warriors ate their morning meal. She kept her expression neutral, her movements steady, giving no one the satisfaction of seeing how much this new life stung. But her mind was working the entire time, turning over every detail of the rejection ceremony, searching for threads she could pull to unravel the truth. At midday, while carrying a stack of clean linens toward the storage room, Elena overheard two young pack members gossiping near the courtyard fountain. She slowed her pace, keeping her eyes down, listening carefully. "I heard Bianca hasn't shifted once since the announcement," one of them said, her voice low but carrying in the quiet afternoon air. "Not even during training. She keeps saying she's tired, or that the timing isn't right, but 3 days is a long time for a new Luna to avoid showing her wolf to the pack." "Maybe she's just nervous," the other replied. "It's a big transition. Being the alpha's mate is a lot of pressure." "Maybe," the first one said, though her tone suggested doubt. "My mother says, even nervous wolves shift eventually. It's not something you can just decide not to do forever." Elena filed the information away carefully, her heart beating a little faster. Wolves who could not shift, or who avoided shifting, often had something to hide. Injuries, certainly, but also curses, bindings, and other unnatural interference with their wolf nature. It was exactly the kind of detail that might support her mother's suspicion about forbidden practices being used to manipulate the mate bond. She continued her work through the afternoon, folding laundry with mechanical precision, while her thoughts raced through possibilities. If Bianca truly had used some kind of dark magic to fake the mate connection with Damien, then avoiding her own shift made a strange kind of sense. Perhaps the spell, whatever it was, interfered with her wolf in ways that made shifting dangerous, or perhaps it required her human form to remain stable for the deception to hold. That evening, after her duties finally ended, Elena made her way to her mother's quarters, instead of returning to her small servant room. Miriam opened the door before Elena even knocked, as if she had been waiting. "You have news," her mother said, stepping aside to let her in. Elena explained what she had overheard, watching her mother's expression grow increasingly troubled as the details unfolded. Miriam moved to her small collection of old books, tucked away on a shelf in the corner of her room, remnants from her years as head healer. "I kept a few texts when I retired," Miriam explained, running her fingers along cracked spines until she found the one she wanted. "Mostly for reference, in case any of the younger healers needed guidance I could no longer provide in person. This one contains some of the old warnings about forbidden bonding practices." She pulled a thin, weathered book from the shelf and carried it to the small table where Elena sat waiting. The pages inside were yellowed with age, the handwriting old-fashioned and difficult to read in places, but Elena leaned forward eagerly as her mother began flipping through them. "Here," Miriam said finally, tapping a page near the middle of the book. "This section discusses scent binding. It's an old practice, forbidden for generations, that allows one wolf to essentially mask their true scent and replace it with an artificial signature designed to mimic a genuine mate bond in another wolf's senses." Elena leaned closer, scanning the faded text. The book described how such bindings required specific rare ingredients, often difficult to obtain, and typically needed to be performed by someone with knowledge of old magic, someone far outside typical pack healer training. The binding could fool an alpha's senses into believing a false mate connection was real, at least for a period of time, though the book warned that such bindings were inherently unstable and prone to failure under certain conditions. What kind of conditions? Elena asked, her pulse quickening. Miriam scanned further down the page. Physical stress, emotional extremes, and apparently, the moon cycle itself. The binding weakens during a full shift, which would explain why your cousin has been avoiding hers. Elena sat back in her chair, a strange mixture of vindication and horror washing through her. She had suspected something was wrong from the very beginning, but seeing it laid out in an old healer's text, seeing proof that such deception was not only possible, but had apparently been attempted before by others desperate enough to try it, made the reality of her situation feel both more real and more overwhelming. If this is what Bianca did, Elena said slowly, then I need proof. Real proof, not just old texts and suspicious behavior, something Damien himself could see and believe. Her mother nodded, closing the book gently. The full moon is in 11 days. If the binding truly weakens during a shift, that may be your best opportunity to expose it. But Elena, you must be careful. If you are wrong about this, if you accuse Bianca without solid proof, you risk making your situation far worse than it already is. The pack has already accepted Damien's decision. Going against that publicly, without certainty, could see you cast out entirely. Elena understood the warning, understood the real danger it represented, but the alternative, simply accepting a stolen future and watching her cousin wear a crown that rightfully belonged to her, felt impossible to bear. I have to try, she said quietly. Even if it costs me everything I have left. Over the following days, Elena settled into an uneasy rhythm. By day, she performed her servant duties without complaint, scrubbing floors and carrying trays, keeping her head down and her expression carefully neutral whenever Bianca or Damien happened to pass through her line of sight. By night, she researched quietly with her mother, poring over old texts, trying to understand exactly what kind of proof might be needed to expose a scent binding to someone who had no reason to doubt what his own senses told him. She also began paying closer attention to Bianca's daily habits, watching from a careful distance as her cousin moved through the pack house with newfound confidence. Bianca had taken to wearing finer clothes almost immediately, borrowing jewelry from the pack's ceremonial collection that technically should have waited until an official Luna ceremony was performed. She spoke to pack elders with practiced humility, thanking them for their acceptance, praising Damien's leadership at every opportunity, building goodwill with a speed that struck Elena as almost too calculated to be genuine. On the fourth day of her new servant duties, Elena was assigned to deliver a tray of tea to the private meeting room where Damien often conducted pack business. She hesitated outside the door, bracing herself before entering, unsure how she would react to seeing him again in such close quarters after everything that had happened. When she finally stepped inside, she found Damien alone at his desk, reviewing a stack of papers with a furrowed brow. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with everything unsaid between them. "Thank you," Damien said finally, his voice quieter than she remembered it being in the pack house hall during the rejection ceremony. "You can set it there." Elena placed the tray down carefully, her hands steady despite the storm of emotion churning inside her chest. As she straightened, she caught sight of something on his desk that made her pause. A small vial, nearly empty, tucked partially beneath a stack of papers, as if someone had tried to hide it from casual view. "Is something wrong?" Damien asked, noticing her hesitation. Elena forced herself to look away from the vial, meeting his eyes instead. "No, Alpha. I was just leaving." As she turned to go, she risked one more glance at the vial, memorizing its shape and the faint blue tint of whatever liquid remained inside. It was not something she recognized from any pack medicine she had ever seen, and the fact that it had been deliberately concealed beneath papers suggested it was not something Damien wanted anyone, perhaps especially Elena, to notice. She left the room with her mind racing, already planning how she might investigate further without drawing suspicion. That evening, she described the vial to her mother in careful detail, watching Miriam's expression grow thoughtful. "It could be many things," her mother admitted, "but if it relates to what we suspect, it might be something meant to suppress Damien's own senses, to prevent him from noticing anything unusual about the false bond. Some binding practices require the target's own perception to be dulled slightly, especially in the early stages, to prevent them from questioning what their instincts might otherwise catch. "Someone is dosing him," Elena said, horror creeping into her voice. "Bianca is drugging Damien to keep the deception intact." "We don't know that for certain," her mother cautioned. "But it fits the pattern. And if it's true, it means Bianca did not act alone. Someone provided her with both the binding and whatever substance keeps it stable. That person is the key to unraveling all of this." Elena spent the following days trying to identify anyone within the pack who might have the knowledge or resources to create such things, but pack healers were closely monitored, their supplies carefully tracked, and nothing suspicious surfaced through her careful, quiet inquiries. Whoever had helped Bianca, if her mother's theory held true, was either extremely careful or existed entirely outside the pack's usual circles. It was during a supply run to the neighboring town, a task she had volunteered for specifically to expand her search beyond the pack house walls, that Elena first heard the name that would change the direction of her entire investigation. While waiting at a small trading post for her order to be filled, she overheard the shopkeeper speaking quietly to another customer about a rogue wolf who had been spotted on the outskirts of pack territory in recent weeks. A wolf with a reputation for trading in rare and often forbidden ingredients, the kind of things most legitimate healers would never touch. "They call him Kale," the shopkeeper said, lowering his voice as though even speaking the name carried risk. "Comes and goes like smoke. Deals in things most folks pretend don't exist anymore. If you need something unusual, and you don't mind the danger of dealing with a rogue, he's the one people whisper about." Elena's pulse quickened. A rogue wolf trading in forbidden ingredients, operating near pack territory during the exact window when Bianca's deception would have needed to be arranged. It felt like too significant a coincidence to ignore. She left the trading post with her supplies and a new sense of direction, her mind already working through how she might locate this rogue wolf without drawing dangerous attention to herself. If Kale truly held knowledge of the binding used against her, he might also hold the key to breaking it, or at the very least, the proof she needed to finally expose the truth to the entire pack. That night, as she lay in her narrow servant bed staring at the ceiling, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since the rejection ceremony, to feel something other than grief and anger. A quiet, determined hope had begun to take root, small but steady, growing stronger with every piece of the puzzle she managed to uncover. Bianca had built her false crown on a foundation of lies and forbidden magic, and foundations built on lies had a way of eventually collapsing under their own weight. Elena intended to be standing there when it finally did, ready to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in days, allowed herself something close to sleep, her dreams filled not with the pain of rejection, but with the first fragile threads of a plan slowly taking shape. The road leading away from pack territory narrowed into a thin dirt path the further Elena walked, the trees growing denser overhead, until sunlight barely filtered through the canopy above. She had told the kitchen staff she was gathering wild herbs for the evening meal, a believable excuse given her mother's history as a healer, but her true purpose lay much further from the pack house than any herb garden. Finding the rogue wolf named Kale had proven more difficult than she expected. Rogues by nature did not want to be found, especially by anyone connected to established pack structures. But after 3 days of careful, quiet inquiries in the trading town, following whispered rumors from one merchant to another, Elena had finally received directions to an abandoned mill at the edge of the forest, a place where rogues reportedly gathered when passing through the region. She approached the mill cautiously. As afternoon light began to fade toward evening, the structure was old, its wooden walls weathered gray, half its roof collapsed inward from years of neglect. But smoke curled faintly from a makeshift chimney fashioned from stacked stones, and Elena's sharpened senses caught the unmistakable scent of wolf, strong and unfamiliar, drifting from somewhere inside. She hesitated at the threshold, every instinct warning her of the danger in approaching an unknown rogue alone, unprotected by pack status or alpha authority. But the thought of Bianca standing beside Damien, wearing a stolen future like a comfortable coat, pushed her forward despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "I know you're there," a voice called out from inside before she could knock. "You've been circling this building for the better part of an hour. Either come in or leave. I don't have patience for either option taking much longer." Elena straightened her shoulders and pushed open the door. The interior was dim, lit only by a small fire burning in the center of the room, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust enough to make out the figure seated near the flames. Kale looked nothing like she had imagined. She had pictured someone rough and menacing, a wolf hardened by years outside pack protection, but the man before her had an almost scholarly appearance, dark hair pulled back from a sharp, intelligent face, and eyes that studied her with open curiosity rather than hostility. "You're not here to trade herbs," he said, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "Your scent carries too much pack structure for someone simply gathering ingredients. Something else brought you all this way." Elena sat carefully, keeping a reasonable distance between them, her senses alert for any sign of danger. "I'm looking for information," she said, "about a binding, a scent binding, specifically, one that could fake a mate bond between two wolves who don't actually share one." Something shifted in Kale's expression, subtle but noticeable. A flicker of recognition quickly masked behind a more neutral expression. "That's a dangerous thing to be asking about," he said carefully, "and an even more dangerous thing to be involved with, whichever side of it you find yourself on." "I'm on the side that got robbed," Elena said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "My mate bond, my future. Someone stole it, using exactly the kind of binding I'm describing, and I need to understand how it works if I have any hope of exposing it." Kale studied her for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, before he finally spoke again. "There's a woman," he said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care, "came through here about 2 weeks ago. Young, pretty, desperate in a way that made her dangerous. She had gold, more than most rogues see in a year, and she wanted something specific. A binding strong enough to convince an alpha's senses, temporary, but stable enough to last through a formal claiming ceremony." Elena's heart pounded against her ribs. "Bianca." "She didn't give a name," Kale continued, "but the description matches what you're describing well enough. I turned her away initially. That kind of magic is exactly the sort of thing that gets rogues hunted down by pack enforcers when it goes wrong, and it almost always goes wrong eventually." "But she found someone else," Elena guessed. Kale nodded slowly. "There's an old witch, exiled from her own coven generations ago, for practicing exactly this kind of forbidden work. Goes by the name Odette now. Lives deep in the western woods, well outside any pack's usual territory. If your cousin, and I'm assuming that's who we're discussing, given the family resemblance in your scent, wanted a binding like this arranged, Odette is the only one within reasonable distance capable of doing it properly." Elena absorbed the information carefully, filing away every detail. "Will you help me find her? This Odette?" Kale was quiet for a long moment, studying the fire rather than meeting her eyes. "There will be a price," he said finally. "I don't do anything without one, and this particular favor carries real risk for me. Odette doesn't take kindly to rogues sending trouble her way." "Name it," Elena said without hesitation. "Whatever you want. If it's within my power to give, it's yours." "A favor," Kale said, "unspecified for now, to be called upon at a time of my choosing. I have my own conflicts with the Pack Council in this region, disputes that predate whatever is happening between you and your cousin. Having someone with insider knowledge and a personal stake in seeing certain things exposed could prove useful to me eventually." Elena hesitated, understanding the risk of agreeing to an open-ended bargain with a rogue wolf she barely knew, but she also understood she had few other options available to her. "Agreed," she said finally, extending her hand across the fire. Kale shook it, his grip firm and cold. "Then we have a bargain. I'll take you to Odette, but I want to be clear about something first. Even with proof of the binding, even with the witch herself willing to testify, your alpha may not believe you. Bindings this sophisticated leave little obvious trace once the initial working is complete. You may need more than words to convince him." "What kind of proof would be enough?" Elena asked. Kale considered the question seriously. "The binding weakens during a full shift, as I imagine you've already discovered, given how carefully you're asking these questions. If your cousin is forced to shift in front of witnesses, particularly your alpha, the false bond may crack just enough for his own senses to catch the deception. That would be far more convincing than any story told secondhand." Elena nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications. The full moon was still more than a week away, but perhaps there were other ways to force a shift outside of the natural cycle. Situations of extreme stress or danger that sometimes triggered involuntary shifting, even in wolves trying desperately to avoid it. They set out for Odette's dwelling the following morning, Kale leading the way through increasingly unfamiliar forest terrain, while Elena struggled to keep pace, her human senses no match for a rogue who had spent years learning to navigate wild country without pack protection or established trails. The journey took the better part of a day, winding deeper into the western woods until the trees grew ancient and twisted, moss hanging thick from branches that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Odette's home, when they finally reached it, was a small cottage built into the side of a hill, half hidden by overgrown vines and wildflowers that seemed to grow in defiance of the season. Smoke curled from a chimney fashioned from river stones, and the air around the cottage carried a strange, herbal scent that made Elena's nose wrinkle with unfamiliarity. The old witch who answered their knock was smaller than Elena expected, her frame bent slightly with age, but her eyes were sharp and assessing, missing nothing as she studied her unexpected visitors. "Kale," she said, her voice raspy but strong. "It's been some time since you've bothered my doorstep. And you've brought company." "She needs answers," Kale said simply. "About the young woman who came to you recently for a scent binding." Odette's expression shifted, wariness creeping into her sharp gaze. "I don't discuss my work with strangers," she said, moving to close the door. Elena stepped forward quickly, desperation overriding caution. "Please," she said, "that binding stole my mate bond, my future. I'm not here to bring trouble to you. I just need to understand what was done so I can find a way to expose it before it destroys more than just my own life." Odette paused, studying Elena's face with unsettling intensity, as if she were reading something written just beneath the surface of her skin. After a long moment, she stepped back and gestured for them to enter. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we should talk." Inside, the cottage was cluttered with jars of dried herbs, strange bottles filled with liquids of various colors, and shelves lined with books far older than anything Elena had seen even in her mother's small collection. Odette settled into a worn chair near her hearth and gestured for her guests to sit as well. "Your cousin came to me nearly 3 weeks ago," Odette began without further prompting, once Elena and Kale had settled across from her. "Desperate, as most who seek my particular services tend to be. She wanted a binding capable of convincing a true alpha's senses, strong enough to override an existing bond between him and someone else. That kind of work is difficult and dangerous, and I told her as much before agreeing to help." "Why did you agree?" Elena asked, unable to keep an edge of accusation from her voice. Odette's expression hardened slightly, "Because she offered payment I could not easily refuse, and because I am, whatever else I might be, still a practitioner who takes pride in her craft. The challenge appealed to me, foolish as that may sound now, hearing the pain in your voice." She continued to explain the binding in careful detail, describing how it worked by essentially layering an artificial scent signature over Bianca's natural one, something specifically designed to trigger recognition patterns in an alpha's senses, similar to a genuine mate bond. The binding required rare ingredients, difficult to obtain, and needed to be renewed periodically, through a specific tincture to remain stable. "The vial," Elena said suddenly, remembering the small container she had glimpsed on Damien's desk. Blue-tinted liquid, kept hidden beneath papers. Odette nodded grimly. "That would be the stabilizing tincture, though I'm surprised to hear it's in the alpha's possession, rather than your cousin's. Unless she found a way to introduce it into something he consumes regularly, which would be a clever, if deeply concerning, method of ensuring the binding remains undetected." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity now. Bianca was not just wearing a false bond. She was actively drugging Damien to maintain the deception, keeping his senses dulled just enough that he could not recognize the lie being fed to him day after day. "Will you help me expose this?" Elena asked, meeting Odette's sharp gaze directly. "Will you testify to what you've told me, if it comes to that?" Odette was quiet for a long moment, weighing the request carefully. "I do not typically involve myself in pack politics," she said finally. My exile from proper society came at a steep cost, and I have learned to value the quiet distance I've built for myself since then. But there is a counter-working, a ritual capable of breaking the binding entirely, if performed correctly, and I find myself unable to simply walk away, knowing the harm this particular working has already caused. Elena's breath caught with hope. "You'll help me break it?" "I will provide what you need," Odette said. "But the ritual itself must be performed by someone connected to the situation, someone with a genuine stake in seeing the truth restored. I can guide you, but the final steps will require your own hands, and your own resolve." As Odette began explaining the components needed for the counter-ritual, listing ingredients Elena would need to gather, and steps that would need to be followed with exact precision, Elena felt the weight of the task ahead settling over her shoulders. This would not be simple. It would require careful timing, courage, and a level of risk that could easily backfire if any part of the plan went wrong. But for the first time since the rejection ceremony, Elena felt something solid beneath her feet. Not just suspicion, not just anger, but an actual path forward, a way to reclaim what had been stolen from her through lies and forbidden magic. As evening fell, and Elena prepared to make the long journey back toward Pack territory, Odette's parting words echoed in her mind, a warning, wrapped in quiet wisdom. "Be careful how you use what I've given you," the old witch said. "Truth has a way of cutting everyone it touches, not just the guilty. Make certain you're prepared for what comes after the lie finally breaks, because there is rarely a clean return to how things were before." Elena nodded, understanding the warning, even as her resolve remained unshaken. She had already lost everything once, in front of the entire pack, with no warning and no chance to defend herself. Whatever came after the truth was finally exposed, she would face it with her eyes open, prepared for whatever price the truth demanded. Elena returned to the pack house just before dawn. Slipping through a side entrance she knew the guards rarely watched closely during the early hours. Her body ached from the long journey, her mind heavy with everything Odette had revealed, but there was no time to rest. The gathering used for the counter-ritual needed specific ingredients, several of which grew only in particular conditions, and she had less than 2 weeks before the full moon arrived to force the natural confrontation Kale had described. She spent the following days moving carefully between her servant duties and quiet moments of research, always watching for any opportunity to gather what she needed without drawing suspicion. Her mother helped where she could, using her old healer credentials to request certain herbs from the pack's medicine stores under the guise of treating minor ailments among the kitchen staff. Silver thread, moonflower petals harvested only at dusk, a particular type of clay found near running water. These were among the items Odette had listed, each one seemingly mundane on its own, but combined in specific proportions, capable of unraveling the binding holding Damien's senses captive. On the 6th day since her visit to the witch's cottage, Elena noticed a change in Bianca's behavior that made her pause during her afternoon duties. Her cousin appeared paler than usual, moving through the pack house with less of her characteristic grace, occasionally pressing a hand to her temple as though fighting off a headache. Elena watched from a careful distance as Bianca excused herself from a conversation with several pack elders, walking quickly toward the private wing reserved for the Alpha and his intended mate. Curiosity overriding caution, Elena found a reason to follow, carrying a basket of folded linens toward a nearby storage closet that happened to sit close enough to overhear voices through a partially open door. "You said this would be manageable," Bianca's voice hissed, low and sharp with barely controlled panic. "You said the tincture would keep everything stable until after the formal claiming ceremony." Elena recognized the second voice immediately, as belonging to one of the younger pack servants, a woman named Priya, who worked primarily in the medicine stores. It seemed Bianca had found her own accomplice within the pack itself, someone with access to supplies and knowledge of how to keep the deception running smoothly. "It is stable, as long as you take it exactly as instructed," Priya replied, her tone carrying an edge of nervous frustration. "But you missed doses twice this week, and the effects compound when the binding isn't properly maintained. If you keep being careless, it will fail entirely, and far sooner than either of us wants." "I can't keep sneaking around like this forever," Bianca snapped. Every time I have to slip away to take that awful tincture, someone questions where I've gone. Damien is already starting to ask why I disappear so frequently. Then don't disappear, Priya said. Find a way to make it part of your routine, something he won't question. Tea, perhaps, something you can claim helps with the stress of transitioning into your new role. Elena's pulse raced as she absorbed every word, pieces of the puzzle locking into place with satisfying clarity. Not only did she now have confirmation of the binding itself, she had discovered a second conspirator within the pack, someone actively helping maintain the deception from the inside. This was exactly the kind of proof that could strengthen her case immeasurably, assuming she could find a way to use it without immediately exposing herself before she was ready. She backed away from the door quietly, careful not to disturb the linens in her basket or make any sound that might alert the two women to her presence. As she moved back toward the main hallway, her mind raced through the implications of what she had just overheard. Priya worked in the medicine stores, which meant she likely had access to a wide variety of ingredients and supplies that could be tracked if Elena knew exactly what to look for. If she could find evidence linking specific missing supplies to the timeline of Bianca's binding, it would add another layer of undeniable proof to the case she was slowly building. That evening, Elena shared everything she had overheard with her mother, watching Miriam's expression shift from concern to something closer to grim determination as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "This is bigger than we initially thought," Miriam said, pacing slowly across the small room. "If Priya has been supplying the tincture, there will be records, purchase logs, inventory counts, that don't quite match what should be on the shelves. As a former healer, I still have some access to those records, or at least enough familiarity with how they're organized to know where to look." "Would that be dangerous for you?" Elena asked, worry creasing her brow at the thought of dragging her mother deeper into potential danger. "Less dangerous than watching my daughter suffer through a stolen future, while I do nothing to help reclaim it," Miriam said firmly, and Elena felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Over the following days, Elena and her mother worked in careful tandem, gathering pieces of evidence from multiple directions. Miriam quietly reviewed medicine store records during her occasional visits to check on the health of elderly pack members, noting discrepancies in supply counts that aligned suspiciously well with the timeline Odette had described. Meanwhile, Elena continued gathering the physical ingredients needed for the counter ritual, working carefully at dusk each evening to harvest moonflower petals from the small garden behind the pack house, mixing specific clay with water from the stream that ran along the eastern boundary of pack territory. She also continued watching Bianca whenever her duties allowed, noting the small cracks beginning to show in her cousin's carefully maintained performance. Bianca grew increasingly irritable with servants, snapped at minor mistakes that would have barely registered before, and her excuses for avoiding her wolf form grew more elaborate and less believable with each passing day. During one particularly tense encounter in the pack house kitchen, Elena watched as Bianca nearly lost her composure entirely when a young pack member innocently asked when she planned to formally shift and introduce her wolf to the pack, as tradition dictated for any intended Luna. "Soon," Bianca said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "There's simply been so much to manage with the upcoming ceremony preparations. My wolf can wait a little longer." The young pack member, sensing tension without fully understanding its source, quickly changed the subject, but Elena caught the flash of genuine fear that crossed Bianca's face before she managed to smooth her expression back into practiced calm. Fear, Elena realized, because Bianca knew exactly what would happen if she was forced to shift while the binding remained active. The truth would come pouring out, uncontrolled and undeniable, in front of anyone unfortunate enough to witness it. That fear became Elena's greatest asset as she continued refining her plan. If Bianca was already avoiding her shift out of terror, then finding a way to force the issue, to create a situation where avoidance became impossible, would accelerate the timeline toward exposure far faster than simply waiting for the natural full moon cycle to arrive. 9 days after her visit to Odette's cottage, Elena received an unexpected visitor at her small servant quarters. Kale stood outside her door as the evening light faded toward darkness, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately put her on alert. "Odette sent word," he said without preamble. "There's been movement. Your cousin visited another practitioner 2 days ago, someone less scrupulous than Odette, seeking a stronger stabilizing agent for the binding. It seems she's growing desperate enough to seek out riskier solutions to keep her deception intact. Elena's stomach twisted with unease. What kind of risk are we talking about? The kind that could genuinely harm the person it's meant to help, Kale said grimly. Stronger bindings often carry stronger side effects. If your cousin succeeds in stabilizing this deception further, it may become significantly harder to break, and the physical toll on her could become severe enough to cause lasting damage to her own wolf. Despite everything Bianca had done, despite the theft and the lies, and the calculated cruelty behind stealing her mate bond, Elena felt an unexpected pang of something close to pity at the thought of her cousin potentially harming herself in increasingly desperate attempts to maintain a lie that was never sustainable to begin with. "We need to move faster," Elena said, her resolve hardening even through the complicated tangle of emotion. "If waiting for the full moon gives her time to find a more dangerous solution, we can't afford to wait that long." Kale nodded slowly. Odette agrees. She's prepared the counter-ritual components ahead of schedule, understanding the urgency now that we know your cousin is actively seeking to strengthen the binding rather than simply maintain it. But forcing an early confrontation carries its own risks. You'll need a reason significant enough to require Bianca's shift outside the normal moon cycle, something Damien himself would demand or expect. Otherwise, she'll simply continue avoiding it through whatever means available to her. Elena's mind raced through possibilities, considering the pack traditions she had grown up understanding, searching for any ritual or event that might naturally require a formal shift from an intended Luna before the actual claiming ceremony took place. "The Border Patrol assessment," she said suddenly, the idea forming with sudden clarity. "Every intended Luna must participate in at least one Border Patrol run before the formal claiming ceremony, demonstrating their wolf's strength and speed to the pack's warrior council. It's an old tradition, rarely skipped even in modern practice, meant to ensure the future Luna can physically defend pack territory alongside her mate if the need ever arises." Kale's expression sharpened with interest. "Would Damien require it, given how quickly this bonding has progressed?" "He would," Elena said with growing certainty. "The Warrior Council takes that tradition seriously, and Damien has always respected their input on matters of pack security. If they request it, even the Alpha wouldn't simply dismiss the requirement, without raising serious questions among the pack elders." A plan began forming in her mind, delicate and dangerous, requiring careful coordination between herself, her mother, and Kale to ensure every piece fell into place at exactly the right moment. She would need to find a way to encourage the Warrior Council to formally request the Border Patrol assessment, timing it precisely so the counter-ritual components would be ready and positioned when the moment of forced shifting finally arrived. It was a risk, an enormous one, built on a foundation of assumptions that could easily crumble if any single element failed to align correctly. But Elena had already lost everything once, through no fault of her own, standing helpless in front of the entire pack, while her future was stolen away with practiced ease. She refused to remain helpless any longer. As Kale disappeared back into the darkness beyond the packhouse walls, promising to relay her plan to Odette and prepare the necessary ritual components, Elena stood alone in the cool evening air, feeling the weight of what lay ahead settling firmly across her shoulders. The truth was coming, whether Bianca was ready to face it or not, and Elena intended to be standing exactly where she needed to be when it finally broke free. Convincing the Warrior Council to formally request the Border Patrol assessment proved more delicate than Elena had anticipated. She could not approach them directly herself, not without raising immediate suspicion about her motives, given her recent rejection and obvious personal stake in seeing Bianca exposed. Instead, she needed to work through indirect channels, planting seeds that would grow into the request organically, appearing to come from genuine pack tradition rather than any personal agenda. She found her opportunity through Garrick, an older warrior who had trained alongside her father years before his passing, someone who still held a soft spot for Elena despite the pack's collective shift in loyalty following her rejection. She approached him carefully during a quiet moment in the training yard, framing her concern not as an accusation against Bianca, but as genuine worry about proper pack tradition being overlooked during the rush of recent events. "It's just strange," she said carefully, keeping her tone light and thoughtful rather than pointed. "My father always spoke about the border assessment as one of the most important traditions for any intended Luna. I would hate to see it skipped, simply because everything has moved so quickly this time." Garrick's brow furrowed thoughtfully. "You're right," he admitted. "It has been overlooked, hasn't it? I suppose with how sudden this bonding announcement came, it simply slipped through the usual process." Elena said nothing further, allowing the seed she had planted to take root on its own. She knew Garrick well enough to understand he held tradition in high regard, and once the thought settled into his mind, he would likely raise the concern with the rest of the Warrior Council on his own, without any further prompting from her that might raise suspicion. Her instincts proved correct. 3 days later, word spread through the pack house that the Warrior Council had formally requested Bianca complete the traditional Border Patrol assessment before the claiming ceremony proceeded. Elena watched from a careful distance as the announcement was made in the main hall, noting the flash of barely concealed panic that crossed her cousin's face, before Bianca managed to smooth her expression into something resembling gracious acceptance. "Of course," Bianca said, her voice only slightly strained. "I would be honored to demonstrate my wolf's capabilities to the council. When would they like this assessment to take place?" 3 days from now," Garrick announced. "At dawn, along the eastern border trail, as tradition dictates." Elena felt a surge of grim satisfaction watching Bianca's composure crack ever so slightly at the announcement. 3 days. Just enough time for Elena to finalize her preparations with Odette's counter-ritual components, and just short enough that Bianca would have little opportunity to seek out a stronger, more dangerous binding solution before the confrontation arrived. Over the following 3 days, Elena worked with meticulous care, coordinating with Kale through brief, carefully arranged meetings near the forest edge, where their conversations would go unnoticed by pack members going about their usual business. Odette had prepared everything needed for the counter-ritual, packed carefully into a small satchel that Kale delivered on the second evening, along with detailed instructions written in Odette's cramped, careful handwriting. The ritual itself, Elena learned as she studied the instructions late into the night, required precise timing. The counterworking needed to be activated during the exact moment Bianca's wolf attempted to emerge, using the natural stress and physical exertion of a forced shift to weaken the binding just enough that the counter-ritual could shatter it entirely. Elena would need to be present at the border assessment, positioned close enough to activate the ritual components at precisely the right moment, without drawing attention to what she was doing, until it was already too late for anyone to stop her. Her mother helped her rehearse the ritual steps repeatedly, ensuring Elena understood the exact sequence required, the precise words that needed to be spoken, the careful way the silver thread needed to be woven around the moonflower petals and pressed into the specially prepared clay. Any mistake, Odette had warned through Kale, could render the entire working useless, wasting their single best opportunity to expose the truth before Bianca had time to seek out stronger protective measures. On the morning of the assessment, Elena rose before dawn, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation as she prepared herself for what lay ahead. She dressed carefully in practical clothing suited for the outdoor terrain of the eastern border trail, tucking the small satchel containing the ritual components securely beneath her jacket, where it would remain hidden from casual observation. The Warrior Council had gathered a modest audience for the assessment, as was traditional, including several senior pack elders, and, notably, Damien himself, standing at the front of the small crowd, with an expression Elena could not quite read. Was that concern on his face, watching Bianca prepare for her wolf's first public demonstration? Or simple curiosity about a tradition he had perhaps never given much thought to before now? Bianca arrived at the border trail looking pale despite her attempts to appear composed, her hands slightly trembling as she removed her outer garments in preparation for the shift, following the modest privacy screen the pack traditionally provided for such moments. Elena positioned herself carefully among the small crowd, close enough to the assessment area that she would have a clear line of sight and reasonable proximity for activating the ritual components when the critical moment arrived. "Whenever you're ready," Garrick called out, his voice carrying the formal tone traditional for such assessments. Bianca closed her eyes, and for a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The crowd waited in uncomfortable silence as her cousin's breathing grew visibly labored, her body tensing with obvious effort as she attempted to trigger the shift that should have come naturally to any healthy wolf. "Is something wrong?" one of the pack elders asked, concern creeping into her voice as the silence stretched uncomfortably long. "I'm fine," Bianca gasped out, though her voice carried clear strain. "Just nervous. Give me a moment." Elena watched with growing tension as her cousin tried again, her body shuddering with the effort of attempting to force a shift that some unseen force seemed determined to prevent. This was it, Elena realized, the exact confrontation she had spent weeks working toward finally arriving. The binding was fighting against Bianca's own attempt to shift, exactly as Odette had predicted it might. Carefully, Elena reached beneath her jacket and withdrew the small satchel, her fingers finding the prepared components by memory as she began the ritual sequence Odette had taught her, murmuring the required words under her breath, while her hands worked the silver thread through the moonflower petals with practiced precision. The effect was immediate and startling. Bianca's entire body convulsed, as though struck by an invisible force, a strangled cry escaping her lips as her carefully maintained composure shattered completely. The crowd gasped collectively, stepping back in alarm as something visibly shifted in the air around her, a faint shimmer that most present would likely dismiss as a trick of morning light, but which Elena recognized immediately as the binding beginning to fracture under the combined pressure of forced shift and counter ritual. "What's happening to her?" someone in the crowd called out, alarm evident in their voice. Damien moved forward instinctively, concern overriding his usual composed demeanor as he approached Bianca, who had fallen to her knees, her body racked with visible tremors. As he drew closer, Elena watched his expression shift from concern to confusion, his nostrils flaring slightly, as though catching a scent that did not match what he expected. "Something is wrong with her scent," he said slowly, more to himself than to anyone else, though several pack members standing nearby overheard clearly enough. "It's shifting, changing." Elena finished the final words of the counter ritual, just as Bianca's convulsions reached their peak, the shimmer in the air around her cousin intensifying briefly before dissipating entirely, leaving behind an unmistakable clarity that Elena could sense even from her position among the crowd. The binding had broken. Bianca collapsed fully onto the ground, gasping for breath, her wolf still refusing to emerge despite the shattered binding, though now for entirely natural reasons rather than magical interference. Damien knelt beside her, his expression a mixture of concern and something darker, something that suggested his senses were finally processing information that had been artificially concealed from him for weeks. "This isn't right," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the gathered crowd. "This isn't the scent I remember from the night of the harvest gathering. This isn't my mate's bond." Bianca, still struggling to catch her breath on the ground before him, looked up with wide, panicked eyes, the careful mask she had maintained for weeks, finally, irrevocably broken in front of the entire assembled crowd. "I can explain," she gasped out, though her voice carried no real conviction, only the desperate scramble of someone caught with nowhere left to hide. Elena stepped forward from the crowd, her heart pounding, but her voice steady, as she finally spoke the words she had been preparing for weeks. "I think I can help explain what's happened here," she said, her eyes meeting Damien's shocked gaze directly for the first time since the rejection ceremony that had started this entire ordeal. The crowd turned toward her as one, confusion and dawning understanding rippling through the gathered pack members as they began to grasp the magnitude of what had just unfolded before their eyes. Elena felt the weight of every gaze upon her, but for the first time in weeks, she did not shrink from the attention. She stood tall, ready to finally speak the truth she had fought so hard to uncover. The border trail fell into a stunned hush as Elena stepped fully into the open space, where Damien still knelt beside Bianca, his hand hovering uncertainly near her shoulder, as though he could no longer decide whether comfort or suspicion was the appropriate response. Every pack member present watched Elena with wide eyes, waiting to hear what explanation could possibly account for the strange shimmer they had all witnessed, and the sudden confusion clouding their alpha's expression. "There is a binding," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. A forbidden practice that allows one wolf's scent to be masked and replaced with something designed to trick another wolf's senses into recognizing a false mate connection. My cousin sought out a witch outside pack territory nearly 3 weeks ago, before the harvest gathering, and paid for exactly this kind of working to be placed upon her. Gasps rippled through the crowd, several pack elders exchanging shocked glances as the implications settled over them. Bianca, still on her knees, opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words emerged, her earlier composure completely abandoned in the face of such direct exposure. "This is absurd," one of the pack elders finally said, though her voice carried more uncertainty than conviction. "Scent bindings are old superstition, forbidden precisely because they're considered nearly impossible to achieve successfully." "Nearly impossible," Elena agreed, "but not entirely impossible, as we've all just witnessed." Alpha Damien himself noted that the scent he detected just moments ago did not match what he remembered from the night everyone believes the bond first formed. That is not superstition. That is direct evidence from his own senses. Damien rose slowly from his kneeling position, his expression a complicated mixture of confusion, dawning realization, and something that looked uncomfortably close to betrayal. He turned to look at Bianca, who remained huddled on the ground, her earlier tears now replaced with a hollow, defeated expression. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority that demanded honesty. Bianca's silence stretched long enough that several pack members shifted uncomfortably, waiting for either confirmation or denial. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the profound quiet of the gathered crowd, everyone heard her clearly. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her composed mask completely shattered now, revealing something raw and desperate beneath. "I just wanted, just once, to have something that was truly mine. Elena always had everything, the bond, the future, the certainty of her place in this pack. I wanted that certainty for myself." "So you stole it," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt, though anger now colored her words in a way she no longer tried to hide. "You stole my future because you wanted certainty, without any regard for what it would cost me, or what it would cost Damien to be manipulated into a bond that was never real." Bianca flinched at the accusation, but did not deny it further. The truth, once exposed, seemed to drain whatever fight remained in her, leaving only the raw admission of guilt hanging heavy in the morning air. Damien's expression hardened as the full weight of the deception settled over him. "Weeks," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Weeks of believing something that was never true. Every moment I spent with you, every decision I made based on what I believed was a genuine mate bond, was built on a lie. I was drugging you," Bianca admitted suddenly, the confession seeming to spill out of her, now that the initial truth had already broken free, as though there was no longer any point in withholding further details. "The tea, in the mornings, it kept the binding stable, kept your senses from questioning what should have felt wrong from the beginning." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd at this new revelation, and Elena watched Damien's face shift from shock to something colder, harder, as the personal violation of the deception truly registered. This was not simply a stolen bond. This was an ongoing manipulation of his own body and mind, carried out deliberately and repeatedly over the course of weeks. "Who helped you?" Damien demanded, his voice carrying the full authority of an alpha whose patience had entirely run out. "This binding, this tincture, someone within this pack assisted you in maintaining this deception." "I want a name." Bianca hesitated, glancing nervously toward the crowd, and Elena watched as Priya, the young servant from the medicine stores, went visibly pale, edging backward, as though hoping to disappear into the gathered onlookers before her involvement could be exposed. "Priya," Bianca finally admitted, her voice barely audible. "She provided the tincture, kept it stocked and hidden among the medicine supplies where no one would question its presence." All eyes turned toward Priya, who had frozen in place, clearly recognizing that flight was no longer a viable option now that her name had been spoken aloud in front of the entire assembled crowd. Garrick and another warrior moved forward instinctively, flanking the young servant to ensure she made no attempt to flee the scene. "I only did what she asked," Priya stammered, tears welling in her eyes. She said it was for a good cause, that you two were meant to be together, and this would simply help nature along a little faster. Damien's expression remained stone cold as he processed the full scope of the conspiracy laid bare before him. He turned his attention back to Bianca, who had finally managed to pull herself into a sitting position, though her earlier composure remained entirely shattered. "You will explain everything," he said, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "Every detail, from the moment you first sought out this binding to every dose administered since. The pack elders will hear the full account, and appropriate consequences will follow, based on what is revealed." As Bianca began her halting, tearful explanation, describing her visit to Odette's cottage and the arrangements made to secure both the binding and its stabilizing tincture, Elena found her attention drawn away from her cousin's confession toward Damien himself. He had moved a few steps away from the immediate scene, his shoulders tense, his expression distant, as though wrestling with implications far beyond what was being openly discussed. She approached him carefully, uncertain of her welcome, despite everything that had just been exposed. "Alpha," she said quietly, using his formal title out of habit, rather than any lingering distance she genuinely felt. Damien turned to look at her, and for the first time since the rejection ceremony, Elena saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes, something that looked remarkably like genuine anguish. "Elena," he said, her name sounding different on his lips now, carrying weight it had not held in weeks. "I rejected you, in front of the entire pack, based on a lie I never should have believed. You had no way of knowing," she said, surprising herself with the genuine compassion in her voice, despite everything she had suffered because of his mistaken belief. "The binding was designed specifically to deceive an alpha's senses. You were not foolish for trusting what your own instincts told you, even though those instincts had been manipulated against your knowledge. That does not erase the pain you endured, because of my decision," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I stood before the entire pack and cast aside a bond that was real, that I had felt building between us for months before that gathering, all because a lie was crafted precisely well enough to override what I should have trusted." Elena felt the weight of unspoken emotion building between them, months of genuine connection, now colored by weeks of separation and public humiliation, all of it converging in this single, charged moment on the eastern border trail. She did not yet know how to answer him, did not yet know how much of her earlier trust could simply be restored, now that the truth had finally come to light. "We will need time," she said finally, choosing honesty over easy reassurance. "This has not been simple for either of us, and healing from it will take more than a single confession on a forest trail, no matter how thorough the truth finally proves to be." Damien nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression, even through the obvious pain still etched across his features. "Whatever time you need," he said quietly, "I will not push you toward forgiveness before you're ready to offer it, but know that I intend to make this right, in whatever way proves possible, for as long as it takes." Behind them, the confrontation with Bianca continued unfolding, pack elders now peppering her with increasingly pointed questions about the full scope of her deception, while Priya sobbed quietly under Garrick's watchful supervision. The truth Elena had fought so hard to uncover was finally, fully exposed, laid bare before the entire pack, in a manner that left no room for doubt or denial. But as satisfying as vindication felt after weeks of humiliation and grief, Elena understood this was only the beginning of a longer process. Trust, once broken, did not simply repair itself because a lie had been exposed. The path ahead, both for herself and for the pack as a whole, remained uncertain, filled with difficult conversations and painful consequences, still waiting to unfold. She looked back toward Bianca, still surrounded by pack elders demanding further explanation, and felt a complicated tangle of emotions she had not expected. Anger, certainly, and a lingering sense of betrayal that would likely take considerable time to fully process. But also, unexpectedly, a flicker of something close to sadness, remembering the cousin she had once trusted completely, the childhood companion who had somehow transformed into someone capable of such calculated deception. Whatever came next, Elena knew the pack would never be quite the same again. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace, knowing the truth she had fought so hard to uncover was finally standing fully in the light, no longer hidden behind carefully constructed lies and forbidden magic. The days following the confrontation on the eastern border trail passed in a strange, unsettled blur for Elena. News of the exposed bindings spread through the pack house with remarkable speed, transforming her overnight from a quietly pitied outcast into a figure of both sympathy and cautious fascination. Pack members who had barely acknowledged her presence during her weeks of servant duties now approached with awkward apologies, some offering genuine warmth, while others seemed more interested in hearing first-hand details of the dramatic exposure than in her actual well-being. Elena navigated the attention carefully, grateful for the vindication, but wary of how quickly pack loyalty could shift once again if circumstances changed. She had learned enough about the fickle nature of public opinion during her fall from grace to remain cautious about how readily it now seemed to swing back in her favor. The pack elders convened a formal council session 3 days after the border trail confrontation, calling both Bianca and Priya before them to answer for the full scope of their actions. Elena was asked to attend as well, along with her mother, to provide testimony about everything they had uncovered during their weeks of careful investigation. The council chamber felt different than the pack house hall where her rejection had first been announced, smaller and more intimate, though no less formal in its proceedings. Elena sat beside her mother, watching as Bianca was led in by 2 junior warriors, her earlier defiance completely gone, replaced by a hollow resignation that seemed to have aged her cousin considerably in just a few short days. The council chair, an elderly wolf named Aldrich who had served the pack for longer than Elena had been alive, opened proceedings with practiced formality. We are gathered to determine appropriate consequences for actions that have violated pack law regarding forbidden magical practices, as well as the deliberate manipulation of our alpha's bonding senses through unauthorized means. Bianca's testimony, when finally given, filled in remaining details Elena had not yet fully understood. Her cousin explained how jealousy had festered for years, watching Elena receive attention and affection that Bianca herself had always felt entitled to, given their close upbringing and constant comparison by extended family members. When Elena's bond with Damien had activated months earlier, something in Bianca had finally snapped, driving her toward increasingly desperate measures to claim that same certainty and status for herself. "I told myself it wasn't truly harming anyone," Bianca said during her testimony, her voice small and defeated. "That if I could simply make the bond work, everyone would eventually be happy with the outcome. Elena would move on, find someone else, and I would finally have the life I had always wanted, but never quite managed to earn on my own merit." The council listened with grim expressions, occasionally interrupting to ask pointed questions about specific details, timelines, and the exact nature of her arrangement with Odette. Priya's testimony followed, corroborating much of what Bianca had already confessed, while adding additional detail about how she had accessed pack medicine stores to help maintain the deception without detection. When testimony concluded, the council deliberated privately for nearly 2 hours before returning with their decision. Elena sat tensely beside her mother throughout the wait, uncertain what appropriate consequences might look like for a betrayal of this magnitude, one that had caused genuine harm not just to herself, but to the pack's trust in its own leadership and traditions. Aldrich delivered the council's verdict with solemn gravity. "Bianca Hart is hereby banished from this pack, effective immediately, forbidden from returning to pack territory for a period of no less than 10 years, after which her case may be reviewed, if she demonstrates genuine remorse and rehabilitation through her actions during that time." A collective murmur moved through the small gathered audience at the severity of the sentence, though Elena noticed no real surprise on most faces. Forbidden magic used to manipulate an alpha's bonding senses represented one of the most serious violations of pack law, striking at the very foundation of trust that held their entire community structure together. "Priya Devlin," Aldrich continued, turning his attention to the younger woman who had assisted in maintaining the deception, "will face a reduced sentence, given her role as an accomplice, rather than the primary architect of this scheme. 5 years of restricted duties within pack territory, with close supervision, and formal removal from any position granting access to medicine stores or sensitive pack resources." Priya accepted her sentence with visible relief, understanding how much more severe the consequences could have been given the seriousness of her involvement. Bianca, however, remained silent, her expression unreadable as the reality of permanent banishment settled over her. As the council session concluded and pack members began filing out of the chamber, Elena found herself unexpectedly approaching her cousin before the junior warriors could lead her away to begin the formal banishment process. Something in her needed to speak with Bianca directly, one final time, before this chapter of their shared history closed permanently. "Why?" Elena asked simply, once they stood close enough for private conversation, though warriors remained watchful nearby. "We grew up together. You were like a sister to me. How could you do this?" Bianca's eyes, when she finally met Elena's gaze, held none of the calculated triumph Elena had glimpsed weeks earlier during the rejection ceremony. Instead, there was only genuine, exhausted regret. "I don't fully understand it myself," she admitted quietly. "Jealousy is a strange thing. It convinces you that taking what belongs to someone else will somehow fill whatever emptiness exists inside you. It never does, of course. I understand that now. Far too late to matter." "I'm sorry," Elena said, surprising herself with the sincerity of the words. "Not for exposing what you did, because that needed to happen, but sorry that whatever emptiness drove you to this point existed in the first place. I wish you had come to me instead, told me you were struggling, rather than choosing this path." Bianca's composure finally cracked, tears spilling freely down her cheeks for what felt like the first genuine emotion Elena had witnessed from her cousin in weeks. "I know," she whispered. "I know that now, but knowing doesn't undo what's already been done." The warriors stepped forward then, indicating it was time for Bianca to begin her journey away from pack territory, and Elena stepped back, allowing the formal process to proceed without further interference. She watched her cousin disappear through the chamber doors, escorted toward whatever uncertain future awaited someone banished from the only community she had ever known, and felt a complicated mixture of closure and lingering sadness settle over her. That evening, Elena's mother found her sitting quietly in the small garden behind their family quarters, staring up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Miriam settled beside her daughter without speaking at first, simply offering quiet companionship in the wake of such an emotionally complicated day. "You did the right thing," her mother said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them, exposing the truth, no matter how painful the process proved to be. "I know," Elena said softly, "but it doesn't feel like victory, not entirely. It feels like loss, layered on top of loss. I lost my bond with Damien for weeks, lost my status within the pack, and now I've lost my cousin too, even though she's the one who caused all of it." Miriam reached over, squeezing her daughter's hand gently. "Grief and justice can coexist," she said. "You are allowed to feel sorrow for what Bianca threw away, for the family bond that existed before jealousy poisoned it, while also standing firmly behind the consequences she now faces. Both feelings are valid, and neither diminishes the other." Elena nodded slowly, finding comfort in her mother's wisdom, even as the complicated emotions continued churning within her. As they sat together beneath the emerging stars, her thoughts drifted inevitably toward Damien, toward the conversation still waiting to happen between them, now that the immediate crisis of exposure and judgment had concluded. She had told him they would need time, and she still believed that to be true. But sitting in the quiet garden, feeling the weight of the day's events finally settling into something more manageable, Elena found herself wondering what that time might ultimately reveal about the future still waiting to be written between them. The truth had been exposed, justice had been served according to pack law, and the immediate crisis had passed. But healing, as her mother had gently reminded her weeks earlier, rarely followed a clean or simple path. Whatever came next would require patience, honest conversation, and a willingness on both their parts to rebuild something that forbidden magic had nearly destroyed beyond repair. For now, Elena allowed herself simply to breathe, to feel the cool evening air against her skin, and to trust that whatever path lay ahead, she would face it with the same resolve and clarity that had carried her through weeks of investigation and uncertainty. The hardest part, exposing the lie at the heart of her rejection, had already been accomplished. What remained now was the equally challenging work of rebuilding, both her place within the pack and whatever relationship might still be possible with the man whose senses had been so thoroughly deceived. In the weeks following Bianca's banishment, Elena found herself navigating a pack house that felt simultaneously familiar and strange, as though she had returned to a home that had shifted subtly in her absence. Her formal status had been restored almost immediately after the council's verdict, her servant duties dissolved, and her old quarters within the family wing reopened to her, but the transition back into her previous life felt far from seamless. Pack members treated her with a curious blend of deference and caution now, uncertain how to properly interact with someone who had endured such public humiliation, only to emerge vindicated through her own determined investigation. Some approached with genuine warmth, praising her courage and resourcefulness in uncovering the truth. Others remained distant, perhaps embarrassed by their earlier eagerness to accept the false narrative Bianca had constructed, or perhaps simply uncertain how to navigate the complicated social dynamics of a pack still processing such a significant betrayal from within its own ranks. Damien, for his part, gave Elena the space she had requested, though his presence remained a constant undercurrent throughout her days. She would catch glimpses of him during pack gatherings, his eyes finding hers across crowded rooms, with an intensity that suggested he was equally aware of her presence, equally conscious of the unresolved conversation still hanging between them. 3 weeks after the border trail confrontation, Elena received a formal request for a private audience with the Alpha, delivered through Garrick with careful, respectful formality that acknowledged the delicate nature of what such a meeting might involve. She accepted, though her stomach churned with nervous anticipation as she prepared herself for whatever conversation finally awaited them. Damien received her in his private study, the same room where she had once glimpsed the hidden vial that had first confirmed her suspicions about the binding. The space felt different now, cleared of whatever traces remained from the deception that had once poisoned his senses within these walls. "Thank you for coming," he said as she entered, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his desk. "I know I said I would give you the time you needed, and I meant that genuinely, but I find myself unable to simply wait indefinitely without at least attempting to express things I've needed to say since that day on the border trail." Elena settled into the offered chair, folding her hands carefully in her lap as she waited for him to continue. "I'm listening," she said simply. Damien was quiet for a long moment, seeming to gather his thoughts before finally speaking. "I have spent every day since that confrontation replaying the months before it," he said slowly, "trying to understand how thoroughly I was deceived, and more importantly, trying to understand what remained real beneath the layers of manipulation Bianca constructed around us." "What have you concluded?" Elena asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "That everything I felt for you, before that harvest gathering, before whatever poison was slipped into my morning tea began clouding my judgment, was entirely genuine," Damien said, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "The connection between us, the months of growing closer, the certainty I felt about our future together, none of that was manufactured or false. It was real, Elena, and I believe some part of me recognized that, even during the weeks I was deceived into believing otherwise." Elena felt her carefully maintained composure wavering slightly at his words, months of grief and betrayal and cautious hope tangling together in her chest. "Then why did the binding work at all?" she asked, genuinely curious despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "If our bond was real, why didn't your senses simply reject the false one Bianca constructed?" Damien's expression grew thoughtful, clearly having considered this question himself during his weeks of reflection. "Odette explained something to the council during a follow-up consultation they requested," he said. "The binding didn't erase my genuine bond with you, not entirely. It layered itself over that connection, using the tincture to dull my senses just enough that I could no longer clearly distinguish between the real bond and the false one being presented to me. It was manipulation of perception, not destruction of what already existed between us." Elena absorbed this explanation slowly, understanding settling over her with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering hurt. "So our bond never actually disappeared," she said. "It was simply hidden from you, buried beneath deception." "Exactly," Damien confirmed. "Which is why, now that the binding has been fully broken and my senses have had weeks to clear entirely of whatever lingering effects the tincture caused, I find myself feeling the pull toward you stronger than ever before. Not diminished by everything that's happened, but somehow strengthened by the clarity that's returned, now that the deception no longer clouds anything between us. Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she fought to maintain her composure, uncertain how fully she was ready to embrace the vulnerability such an admission demanded from her in return. "I want to believe that," she said honestly. "But Damien, you stood before the entire pack and rejected me. You said words that cannot simply be unspoken, regardless of what caused you to speak them. Rebuilding trust after that kind of public humiliation isn't something that happens instantly, no matter how genuine your feelings prove to be now." "I understand that," Damien said, leaning forward slightly, his expression earnest and unguarded in a way Elena had rarely witnessed from him even during their months of genuine courtship before everything fell apart. "I'm not asking you to simply forget what happened, or to pretend the pain you endured wasn't real and significant. I'm asking for the opportunity to earn back your trust, slowly, through actions, rather than simply words, for however long that process might take." The sincerity in his voice, combined with weeks of her own careful reflection on everything that had transpired, softened something in Elena that she had been guarding carefully since the rejection ceremony. She thought about Odette's warning, delivered weeks earlier in that small cottage deep in the western woods, about how truth had a way of cutting everyone it touched, and how there was rarely a clean return to how things had been before a lie finally broke. Perhaps there wasn't a clean return available to either of them, but perhaps, Elena considered, something new could still be built from the wreckage the deception had left behind, something stronger for having survived such a significant test. "I'm willing to try," she said finally, choosing honesty over easy reassurance she did not yet fully feel. "But slowly, Damien, I need time to fully trust again, time to rebuild what was damaged, even if the underlying bond between us was never truly false to begin with." "Slowly," Damien agreed, something like hope flickering across his features for the first time since she had entered his study. "Whatever pace you need, I will match it. I have already lost you once through circumstances beyond either of our control. I refuse to lose you again through impatience or carelessness on my part." As their conversation continued, moving gradually from the weighty topics of trust and betrayal toward gentler territory, catching up on weeks of separation and the strange, complicated aftermath of Bianca's exposure, Elena felt something within her chest loosening slightly, the tight knot of grief and anger that had lived there for weeks, beginning to unwind just enough to make room for cautious hope. She was not ready to fully embrace what had once seemed like a certain future between them. Too much had happened, too much pain still lingered beneath the surface of her careful composure. But sitting in Damien's study as evening light faded outside the windows, listening to him speak with genuine warmth and vulnerability about a future he still hoped they might share, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since the rejection ceremony, to imagine that perhaps this story was not yet finished unfolding. The path back to what they had once shared would not be simple or immediate. But perhaps, she thought as she finally rose to leave his study that evening, promising to continue their careful conversations in the days ahead, perhaps some things worth having were never meant to come easily in the first place. The weeks that followed settled into a careful, deliberate rhythm as Elena and Damien slowly rebuilt what had been damaged, though not destroyed, by weeks of deception. Their interactions began cautiously, formal conversations during pack gatherings, that gradually softened into genuine warmth as trust rebuilt itself, one careful moment at a time. Damien made no attempts to rush the process, respecting the boundaries Elena had established, while consistently demonstrating, through small daily gestures rather than grand declarations, that his commitment to rebuilding their bond remained steady and sincere. He began seeking her opinion on pack matters that would once have naturally involved a future Luna's perspective, not as an obligation, but as genuine interest in her thoughts and insights. He remembered small details from their conversations, following up on concerns she had mentioned weeks earlier, demonstrating attentiveness that felt entirely different from the practiced charm Bianca had employed during her brief tenure as intended Luna. Elena, for her part, found herself gradually lowering the careful guards she had erected around her heart during the painful weeks of investigation and exposure. She began joining Damien for evening walks along the training yard, the same location where their courtship had first blossomed months earlier, finding a strange comfort in reclaiming spaces that had once been poisoned by association with betrayal and loss. Her mother watched this careful rebuilding process with quiet approval, occasionally offering gentle guidance when Elena struggled with lingering doubts or unexpected waves of residual anger about everything that had transpired. Healing rarely follows a straight path, Miriam reminded her, during one particularly difficult evening when old grief resurfaced unexpectedly during a routine pack gathering. Allow yourself grace for the setbacks, just as much as you celebrate the progress. Word had spread throughout the wider region about the scandal that had unfolded within their pack, and Elena found herself occasionally approached by wolves from neighboring territories, curious about the dramatic circumstances that had led to such a rare and serious council verdict. She handled these inquiries with practiced grace, sharing only what felt appropriate while declining to indulge in gossip that might further complicate an already difficult situation for everyone involved. Priya, having accepted her reduced sentence with visible relief, threw herself into rebuilding trust within the pack, through diligent service in her restricted role, occasionally crossing paths with Elena, in ways that remained awkward but not overtly hostile. Elena found she held less anger toward the young servant than she might have expected, recognizing that Priya had been manipulated by Bianca's persuasive desperation rather than acting from genuine malice of her own accord. 2 months after the confrontation on the eastern border trail, Damien requested another formal meeting with Elena, though this time the request carried a different weight, communicated through Garrick, with careful ceremony that suggested significance beyond their usual private conversations. She arrived at his study to find the space transformed slightly from their previous meetings, soft candlelight replacing the harsh afternoon sun that had illuminated their earlier, more difficult conversation. Damien rose as she entered, his expression carrying a nervous energy she had not witnessed from him since well before their entire ordeal began. "Elena," he began, gesturing for her to sit, though he remained standing himself, pacing slightly as though struggling to find the right words for whatever he intended to say. "These past 2 months have meant more to me than I know how to properly express. Watching you slowly begin trusting me again, seeing glimpses of the connection we once shared returning between us, it has given me hope I honestly wasn't certain I deserved to feel after everything my rejection caused you to suffer." Elena remained quiet, sensing he needed space to continue without interruption, though her heart had already begun beating faster in anticipation of whatever he was working toward. "I'm not asking for everything at once," Damien continued, finally stopping his pacing to face her directly. "I know the formal claiming ceremony, the full acceptance of our bond before the entire pack, still feels too soon given everything we've endured. But I wanted you to know, clearly and without ambiguity, that my intentions toward our future remain exactly what they were before Bianca's interference nearly destroyed everything we had built together. I want you as my mate, Elena, fully, genuinely, without any lingering doubt or hesitation on my part." Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, months of grief and cautious rebuilding, finally converging into something that felt remarkably close to the hope she had once dared to feel before everything fell apart. "I want that too," she admitted softly, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating to finally speak aloud. "I've wanted it since long before the harvest gathering, and despite everything Bianca tried to destroy, that wanting never actually disappeared, even during my darkest weeks of doubt and investigation." Damien's expression brightened with genuine joy at her words, though he remained appropriately cautious, understanding this conversation represented significant progress rather than complete resolution of everything they still needed to work through together. "Then perhaps," he said carefully, "we might begin discussing a timeline for the formal claiming ceremony, whenever you feel genuinely ready, without any pressure attached to rushing that decision before you're fully prepared." "I think," Elena said slowly, considering her own feelings with careful honesty, "I would like that. Not immediately, perhaps, but soon. I want our future together to be built on the genuine foundation we're rebuilding now, rather than rushed simply to erase the memory of what Bianca stole from us." They spent the remainder of that evening discussing possibilities, tentative plans forming between them, with a lightness that had been entirely absent from their interactions, since before the rejection ceremony had shattered everything so publicly and painfully. Elena found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in months, the sound surprising even herself with how naturally it emerged after weeks of careful, guarded interaction. As she prepared to leave his study that evening, Damien walked her to the door, pausing before she departed with an expression that suggested he was working up courage for one final request. "Might I," he asked carefully, "be permitted to court you properly, from this point forward? Not simply rebuilding what was damaged, but building something new alongside it. Courtship as it should have unfolded from the very beginning, without any interference or deception clouding what develops between us." Elena smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest at the earnest sincerity in his request. "I would like that very much," she said, and watched his answering smile transform his entire expression into something open and genuinely happy in a way she had not witnessed since before everything went wrong months earlier. The following weeks brought a courtship that felt entirely different from their earlier, more casual progression toward bonding, months before Bianca's interference. Damien made deliberate efforts to demonstrate his commitment through consistent, thoughtful actions, rather than assuming their bond alone would carry them forward. He arranged quiet dinners away from the Packhouse's constant scrutiny, sought her input on decisions large and small, and made genuine efforts to understand the depth of pain his rejection had caused her, listening without defensiveness whenever she needed to express lingering grief or frustration about everything they had both endured. Elena, in turn, found herself opening more fully with each passing week, the careful guards around her heart gradually dissolving as trust rebuilt itself through countless small moments of genuine connection. She began to recognize, with growing certainty, that whatever had existed between them before Bianca's deception was not only genuine, but perhaps even strengthened by having survived such a significant test of its resilience. 3 months after the confrontation on the eastern border trail, standing together in the same training yard where their courtship had first blossomed, Damien knelt before Elena, beneath the gentle glow of evening starlight, formally requesting her acceptance of their mate bond, this time with no forbidden magic, no hidden deception, only the genuine connection that had proven strong enough to survive even the most calculated betrayal. Elena, tears of genuine joy, rather than grief, streaming freely down her cheeks, accepted without hesitation, feeling the true mate bond settle fully into place between them, unclouded by anything false or manufactured. The connection felt exactly as she remembered from before everything fell apart, warm and certain and entirely real, proof that whatever Bianca had attempted to steal from her had never truly been lost, only temporarily hidden beneath layers of deception that had ultimately failed to withstand the weight of genuine truth. The formal claiming ceremony, when it finally took place before the entire assembled pack weeks later, carried none of the uncertainty or public humiliation that had characterized Elena's earlier rejection. Instead, the Packhouse Hall filled with genuine celebration, pack members who had witnessed her painful fall from grace, now equally present to witness her triumphant, well-earned restoration to the position that had always rightfully belonged to her. As Damien formally declared her his true Luna before the gathered crowd, his voice carrying none of the mechanical hesitation that had marked his earlier rejection, Elena felt the last remaining shadows of grief and doubt finally dissolve completely, replaced by a certainty that felt earned rather than simply given. She had fought for this truth, had risked everything to uncover the deception that nearly destroyed her future, and had emerged not only vindicated, but stronger for having survived such a significant test of her resilience and determination. The pack that had once accepted a lie so readily now celebrated a truth that had been hard-won through courage, careful investigation, and an unwavering refusal to accept injustice without a fight. Elena Whitmore stood beside her true mate, finally claiming the future that had always rightfully belonged to her, a future built not on forbidden magic or careless deception, but on genuine love that had proven strong enough to survive even the most calculated betrayal, emerging on the other side stronger and more certain than it had ever been before. Life within the Packhouse settled into a new and steady rhythm in the months following Elena's formal claiming ceremony, though the peace she had fought so hard to reclaim was not destined to remain entirely undisturbed. Nearly 4 months after standing before the pack as Damien's true Luna, Elena received an unexpected visit that stirred memories of the difficult weeks she had spent investigating the truth behind her rejection. She was walking near the forest edge one quiet afternoon, checking on the small garden where she still occasionally harvested herbs out of habit, formed during her time working alongside her mother, when a familiar figure emerged from the tree line, his presence as quiet and unannounced as it had been during their very first meeting at the abandoned mill. "Cale," Elena said, genuine surprise coloring her voice, as she recognized the rogue wolf who had once guided her toward the truth she desperately needed. "I wondered if our paths would cross again. I told you there would be a price for my help," Cale said, his expression carrying the same careful neutrality she remembered from their earlier dealings. "I've come to collect it." Elena felt a flicker of nervousness at his words, remembering the open-ended bargain she had agreed to weeks earlier, uncertain what exactly he might request, now that circumstances had changed so significantly since their initial arrangement. "What do you need?" she asked carefully. Cale's explanation, once he provided it, revealed a situation more complicated than Elena had anticipated. The Pack Council in his own region, the one he had mentioned holding conflicts with during their first meeting, had grown increasingly hostile toward rogue wolves in recent months, implementing harsh new policies that made survival outside formal pack structure significantly more dangerous than it had traditionally been. Cale sought an audience with Damien, hoping that an alpha who had recently benefited so significantly from a rogue's assistance might be willing to advocate on behalf of rogues facing unjust treatment in neighboring territories. Elena listened carefully, understanding the genuine need behind his request, even as she recognized the delicate diplomatic situation it might create. "This isn't a simple favor," she said honestly. "Damien would need to consider the political implications carefully before agreeing to intervene in another pack's internal policies, regardless of any personal debt he might feel toward you." "I understand the complexity," Cale said. "I'm not asking for guaranteed success, only for the opportunity to make my case directly, rather than remaining an unknown rogue whose concerns are dismissed without proper consideration." Elena agreed to arrange the audience, understanding that honoring her earlier bargain mattered regardless of how complicated the resulting situation might prove to be. She brought Cale's request to Damien that same evening, explaining the full context of their earlier arrangement and the debt she genuinely owed him for his crucial assistance during her investigation. Damien listened thoughtfully, his expression displaying none of the suspicion Elena might have expected from an alpha being asked to potentially involve pack resources in another territory's internal disputes. "If this rogue helped uncover the truth that saved our bond from permanent destruction," he said finally, "the least I can offer is a fair hearing for his concerns, regardless of whether I ultimately decide intervention is appropriate." The audience took place 3 days later, Cale presenting his case with the same careful, articulate manner Elena remembered from their initial meeting at the abandoned mill. He described specific incidents of rogue wolves being unjustly hunted and punished under increasingly harsh policies, providing detailed accounts that painted a troubling picture of systematic mistreatment extending far beyond simple territorial disputes. Damien listened with genuine attention, occasionally asking pointed questions that demonstrated his careful consideration of the political complexities involved. By the audience's conclusion, he had not committed to direct intervention, understanding the delicate nature of interfering with another pack's internal governance, but he agreed to raise formal concerns through proper diplomatic channels, using his growing influence within the broader regional council to advocate for more measured treatment of rogue wolves facing unjust persecution. "It's not everything you hoped for," Elena said to Cale afterward, as they walked together toward the forest edge, where he would begin his journey back toward whatever uncertain future awaited him beyond pack territory. "It's more than I expected, honestly," Cale admitted, a rare hint of genuine warmth coloring his typically guarded expression. Most alphas would have dismissed a rogue's concerns without even granting an audience. "Your mate showed more consideration than most in his position, and that alone represents meaningful progress, even if the ultimate outcome remains uncertain." Before departing, Cale paused, studying Elena with an expression she found difficult to fully interpret. "You handled everything with remarkable courage," he said, uncovering the truth, risking everything to expose a deception most would have simply accepted rather than fight against. "Whatever life brings you moving forward, I suspect you'll continue facing challenges with that same determined resolve." Elena smiled, genuinely touched by the unexpected compliment from someone who had proven such a crucial ally during her darkest weeks. "Thank you, Cale, for everything. I hope your own path leads somewhere safer than the uncertain existence you've described." As he disappeared back into the forest, Elena felt a quiet sense of closure settling over this particular thread of her ordeal, grateful that honoring her bargain had led toward genuine positive change, rather than the complicated political disaster she had initially feared it might become. Word of the audience, and Damien's subsequent diplomatic advocacy for rogue wolves, spread through the region in the following weeks, earning him quiet respect from unexpected quarters, while raising his standing among pack leaders who valued thoughtful, measured leadership over reactive territorial defensiveness. Elena found herself proud of the man she had chosen to bond with, watching him navigate complex situations with genuine wisdom and consideration for perspectives beyond his own immediate pack interests. Meanwhile, life within the pack house continued its steady rhythm of healing and rebuilding. Priya completed her period of restricted service with genuine dedication, eventually earning limited trust back from pack members who had initially viewed her with understandable suspicion following her role in Bianca's deception. Elena found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, becoming something of a quiet mentor to the younger woman, recognizing in her the same vulnerability to manipulation that had made her an easy target for Bianca's persuasive desperation. "You made a mistake," Elena told her during one particularly candid conversation in the pack house gardens, "but mistakes don't have to define your entire future, provided you're willing to learn from them and demonstrate genuine change through your actions moving forward." Priya's gratitude for such understanding, offered by the very person her actions had helped harm, spoke to a growing maturity within Elena herself, a capacity for compassion that extended even toward those who had participated, however unwillingly, in the deception that had once threatened to destroy her entire future. This capacity for understanding, without excusing genuine wrongdoing, would serve her well, she suspected, as she continued preparing for the responsibilities that would eventually accompany her role as Luna. As months passed and the immediate drama of exposure and rebuilding gradually settled into steady, comfortable normalcy, Elena found herself increasingly confident in both her bond with Damien and her own capacity to handle whatever challenges their shared future might eventually present. The girl who had stood humiliated before the entire pack, watching her future stolen away through calculated deception, had transformed through months of determined investigation and careful rebuilding into a woman fully prepared to embrace the leadership role that had always rightfully belonged to her. A full year had passed since the harvest gathering that once marked the beginning of Elena's greatest ordeal, and the pack house prepared for a celebration entirely different from the painful rejection ceremony that had unfolded within those same walls 12 months earlier. This time, the gathered crowd assembled not to witness humiliation and loss, but to celebrate the arrival of new life, as Elena prepared to welcome her first child alongside Damien, their bond having grown steadily stronger through every season that passed, since the truth had finally shattered Bianca's calculated deception. The pack that had once so readily accepted a stranger's lies over genuine truth had transformed alongside Elena and Damien during the intervening months, developing stronger traditions around verifying claims before accepting them, particularly regarding matters as significant as mate bonds and Luna succession. The council had implemented new safeguards following the scandal, formal verification processes designed to prevent any future wolf from exploiting forbidden magic to manipulate pack leadership decisions so easily again. Elena, now fully settled into her role as Luna, had used her position to advocate for these protective measures personally, drawing directly from her own painful experience to help design systems that would prevent other wolves from suffering the same devastating betrayal she had endured. Her willingness to speak openly about her ordeal, rather than simply moving past it in silence, had earned her genuine respect throughout the pack, transforming her personal tragedy into meaningful institutional change that would protect future generations from similar deception. News occasionally reached them regarding Bianca, carried through distant pack networks that tracked banished wolves as a matter of regional security protocol. She had settled eventually in a territory several regions away, living quietly among a small community of other exiled wolves, apparently having found some measure of peace, if not full redemption, in her new circumstances. Elena felt no particular desire to seek further contact, understanding that whatever relationship they had once shared as cousins had been permanently altered by choices that could not simply be undone through time or distance. But she also felt no lingering bitterness weighing down her days, having processed her grief and anger thoroughly enough during the months following the exposure that genuine peace had finally settled over that particular chapter of her history. Priya had completed her restricted service period with distinction, eventually earning full reinstatement within the pack community, her genuine transformation from vulnerable accomplice to trusted, reformed pack member, serving as living proof that mistakes, however serious, did not necessarily define a person's entire future when met with genuine accountability and sustained positive change. Kale's diplomatic efforts, championed initially through Damien's willingness to grant him a fair hearing, had gradually contributed to broader shifts in how rogue wolves were treated throughout the region, though progress remained slow and incremental rather than transformative. He occasionally sent word through careful, indirect channels, updates on his ongoing efforts, that Elena always received with genuine interest and continued gratitude for the crucial role he had played during her darkest weeks. As Elena settled into the final days before her child's arrival, she found herself reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had led her to this moment of genuine happiness and fulfillment. The devastating rejection that had once seemed to destroy every hope she held for her future had ultimately, through her own courage and determination, transformed into the foundation for something far stronger and more genuine than what had existed before Bianca's interference nearly destroyed everything. Damien found her one evening, sitting quietly in the same garden where she had once processed her grief with her mother's steady guidance, her hand resting gently against the gentle curve of her pregnancy as she watched the sunset paint brilliant colors across the evening sky. "You're thinking about everything that's happened," he said softly, settling beside her with the easy familiarity that had grown between them through months of careful, deliberate rebuilding. "I am," Elena admitted, leaning into his warm presence beside her. "It's strange, looking back now. That day felt like the absolute end of everything I had hoped for. Standing in that hall, hearing you speak those rejection words, I genuinely believed my future had been destroyed beyond any possible repair." Damien's arm wrapped gently around her shoulders, his voice carrying quiet reverence as he responded. "And yet here we are," he said. "Not despite what happened, but in many ways, stronger, because of how we both chose to respond to it. You could have simply accepted the injustice, allowed Bianca's deception to permanently steal what rightfully belonged to you. Instead, you fought for the truth, with a courage and determination that continues to inspire me every single day." Elena smiled softly, feeling the truth of his words settle comfortably alongside months of accumulated healing and genuine happiness. "We fought for it together, in the end," she reminded him gently. "Your willingness to hear the truth, to trust what your own senses eventually revealed despite the deception clouding them, mattered just as much as my determination to uncover it." They sat together in comfortable silence, as the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, stars beginning their gentle emergence across the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed Damien's genuine proposal, months earlier, in the very training yard where their courtship had first blossomed and later been so carefully rebuilt. The pack that gathered the following week to celebrate the arrival of Elena and Damien's first child carried none of the tension or uncertainty that had once characterized their painful history together. Instead, genuine joy filled the pack house halls, pack members from every corner of their community coming together to celebrate new life and the enduring strength of a bond that had survived the most calculated betrayal imaginable, emerging on the other side, not diminished, but transformed into something even more resilient and genuine than it had ever been before. Elena Whitmore, once humiliated before her entire pack through no fault of her own, now stood as their beloved Luna, her courage and determination during her darkest weeks, having transformed her personal tragedy into a legacy of strength, justice, and genuine love that would echo through pack history for generations to come. The lie that had once threatened to destroy everything she held dear had ultimately proven no match for the truth she refused to stop fighting for, and the future she had once feared, permanently lost, had blossomed instead into something far richer and more genuine than she had ever dared hope possible during those darkest days following her devastating public rejection. As she held her newborn child for the first time, Damien standing proudly beside her with tears of genuine joy glistening in his eyes, Elena felt the last remaining echoes of that painful rejection ceremony finally, completely fade into distant memory, replaced entirely by the profound happiness of a future built not on deception or forbidden magic, but on truth, courage, and a love strong enough to survive even the most devastating betrayal imaginable.